All right, I'll get started in the program. What? All right, everyone, welcome to Shelley Duvall, a career retrospective. This comes about like roughly on the 1 year anniversary of her passing, which was last year. And we're going to talk about her kind of just splash into fame, accidentally, becoming a muse of one of the great American directors and kind of finding her way back into the limelight in the later years. So we're going to start off. You're like, oh my gosh, Shelley Duvall, where have I seen her before? I mean, with a face like that, that's a very, I mean, the word iconic gets thrown around a lot, but with that face, there's only one real Shelley Duvall face. So she was an it girl of the 1970s. She was a big muse for Robert Altman. She was in six of his films total. She was called by Pauline Kael the female Buster Keaton. And she was also compared to the fashion model Twiggy. If you're not familiar with who Twiggy is, she was the very skinny blonde British model who also had those like really big eyelashes, as you see in the bottom right corner. But she was someone who was very present in the 70s and in the 1980s, but she's also one of those actresses that kind of faded from the limelight in the 90s, and we'll discuss that later on. It's not quite a Setsuko Hara style retirement. There were other things at play, but she's worked with, again, greats like Robert Altman. She's worked with Stanley Kubrick. She's worked with Terry Gilliam, Jane Campion. She's in Annie Hall with Woody Allen. But she's probably best known for her work with Robert Altman and being in The Shining, which we will get to, and just for being a very kind of a quirky girl icon. And this is something I believe I've talked about before. Like, if you look at a lot of movie stars starting from the 90s onward, people looked very pretty. People looked almost like supermodels. But back in the 1970s and the 1970s, the 1980s, and we're actually seeing a little bit of a return to it now. People looked like normal people. I don't want to say the word ugly, but I would say they did not look like people who walked off, a fashion shoot. Even though I will do this caveat, a lot of women and men who are fashion models in the fashion industry are not your like traditionally pretty people. If anything, that is a place where you can be a bit more unusual looking, but still, um, she's someone who has like a very not a face you would see every day, but also not a traditional California Hollywood beauty face. And before we go any further, if you were to ask me what I knew Shelley Duvall from, my first encounter with her, it was not Robert Altman. It was not The Shining. It was her saying, "Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall," as she opened another episode of Fairy Tale Theater, which I can't wait to talk about. So, Shelley Duvall is not someone who dreamed of being an actress. She's not someone who dreamed of being on the big screen. She was a girl from Texas. Her father was a cattle auctioneer who became a lawyer, and her mother was a real estate agent. And she had three brothers, so a very normal upper middle class upbringing. And they eventually lived in Houston. And she wanted to be a scientist. So and she talked about when she was growing up, she like, in Houston and in Texas in general, the space industry was there. So she kind of had that interest and she wanted to be a biologist. She started off in community college, but she had to observe a monkey vivisection. And that made her not only leave her dreams of being a scientist behind, but leave college altogether. She's like, no, no, thank you. And the other thing that had her interest when she was young were boys. And she talked about when she was young, she was actually a very good student. And then, and sometime in the 11th grade, she discovered boys. When she talked about her childhood, she said that she was very Could be very particular. She talked about one time she was standing next to someone in choir who was singing off key, and she's like, I couldn't deal with it. I just had to leave. And she's talked about her mother would say she would talk like Minnie Mouse and she'd be very fast paced. As an ADHD child, I relate. Um, but turns out leaving community college and dating a boy is what actually led to her finding her way into the film industry. So at the time she was dating Bernard Sampson, who was an artist, and she was hosting a party to kind of show off his artwork. So there were a couple of crew members from Robert Altman's new film. They were scouting locations in Texas, and she was just pitching her boyfriend's artwork to them. And they were so charmed by her. They're like, "Hey, would you like to come talk about artwork to some people we know?" And this actually was a secret audition. And she actually said, she's like, "Oh, I've been approached before to be in movies, but they were dirty movies." So, and she turned that down. But this was actually what the crew members did is they're like, okay, let's have her produce it to pitch this artwork to Robert Altman and his producers. And they ended up loving her and going, "You are perfect for a part in this movie." Robert Altman liked to cast actors, but he also, if he could, would like to kind of cast a lot of amateurs or at the very least new actors. I would say kind of similar to Sean Baker, where there are people who have training in his films, and then there are other people where he just kind of sees like, "I like your vibe. I think you'd be cool." So she ends up getting her first role in the really fun film Brewster McCloud, starring Bud Cort. If you're not familiar with who Bud Cort is, he's the lead in Harold and Maude, which is a great movie. So she ends up playing Suzanne, who's a tour guide at the Houston Astrodome. Very fun, flirty, talks a mile a minute. And this led to her working with Altman for an entire decade. Um, and when she first started working with Altman, again, this is someone she hadn't even done drama club before. She'd never done a school play. Like the most she'd done is choir. Altman told her to never take classes. So this is from an interview magazine from 1977. She goes, to try. She goes, "I went to Lee Strasberg a few years ago because I'd heard good things about him, but I went for 2 lessons and it just wasn't for me." That's the one piece of advice Altman gave me in the very beginning. Never take lessons and don't take yourself seriously. And if you are a fan of Robert Altman's movies, you can definitely kind of see why he doesn't like the taking lessons thing. He does work with improv a lot, but Altman is someone who, I think, saying he doesn't want people who take themselves too seriously is very on point. He wants you to act like you're a person, not like you're someone making a movie. So, when she worked with Altman throughout the 70s, she made a total, well, from 1970 to 1980, she made a total of 6 films with him. And Altman is one of those people where if he likes you in a movie, he is going to keep casting you. And there are a lot of directors who are like that. Once they find a performer that works, they're like, "Okay, I'm going to try to find a place for you. It might not be in every film, but I'm going to see if I can utilize you." So she does Brewster McCloud, then The Great McCabe and Mrs. Miller, then Thieves Like Us, which is where she picked up her smoking habit from. And when she did Thieves Like Us, that's when Altman told her, he's like, "I think you're a great actress." And so that's when she actually starts being like, "Okay, I'm going to start working with people besides Robert Altman." Because for a while she had worked with him almost exclusively. Then she's in Nashville, another great film, which I'm kicking myself for not buying the Criterion Blu-ray when I could, because now it's out of print. Buffalo Bill and the Indians, and she's in Three Women, and then she finishes up her collaboration with him with Popeye, which, Todd, you've watched Popeye, right?
It has been years. It's one I've been telling myself I need to go back to.
Yeah, so Popeye was a film that I really did not have interest in seeing when I was younger because I had known the Popeye cartoons from being a kid. I did not much like the Popeye cartoons, but the great podcast 80s All Over inspired me to actually watch it. And I don't know if I'd call it a great movie because ultimately I don't think that a lot of what the movie was doing was necessarily for me. But if you want to talk about a cartoon come to life, Popeye is fantastic. Both Robin Williams and Shelley Duvall get the cartoonishness of their character, but they also get that you kind of have to ground it a little bit in live action reality. But you watch that and you're just like, Shelley Duvall is so funny. Like she could have had like a really good slapstick career. I almost like she could have she's someone where like not that Julie Haggerty is not amazing in Airplane, but Shelley, I kind of am like, what's an alternate universe where Shelley Duvall was took Julie Haggerty's part? It's an interesting thought experiment. And when she was asked like why she keeps working with him, she goes, "He offers me good roles. None of them have been alike. He has a great confidence in me, a trust and respect for me, and he doesn't put any restrictions on me or intimidate me. And I love him." Which is a really nice thing to hear about a director because a lot of times when you hear women working with male directors, stuff comes out later and it's like, oh no, that was terrible. So, uh, and that seems to be across the board. A lot of people have worked with Altman where he's like, I trust what you can do with this scene. But if I had to really recommend one film that she did with Altman, it would be Three Women, which I just rewatched last night because Todd had not seen it. And it is not only a different role for her, but it's a different movie for Robert Altman. So a lot of I mean, if you had to describe a lot of Altman's filmography, I'd almost describe it as just Americana. Although he does have some stuff like he's done stuff like Gosford Park, but a lot of his movies are very based on like the idea of America, American storytelling, in some cases American mythology. Um, but Three Women, it's very dreamlike, it's very surreal. There is this underlying sinister element to it. Um, this this came from a dream Robert Altman had, where he said he dreamed about three women being together. He dreamed about the setting, and it's a really interesting. I don't even know if I'd call it like a psychological profile of these women, but it's a very you kind of can't take this movie just on its surface level of storytelling. So, um, Shelley's character is Millie, and she's someone who likes to fashion herself as like this modern working woman. However, you get the sense very quickly that a lot of it is a front. She's much more insecure than she lets on. And you also see very quickly that a lot of the people that she works with can't really stand her. And she likes to present herself as a social butterfly, but a lot of people just ignore her. So she's trying to be this person or, become this person. It's not quite. And then Sissy Spacek is this new girl in town who is very childlike. And then about halfway through the movie, they don't quite switch personalities, but Sissy Spacek tries to become what Millie was early on, and then Millie becomes more of a mother role. And then there's a third person, a woman in the kind of in the outskirts of this film, played by Janice Rule. And I'm not going to say the movie ends with a murder, but it's heavily implied. Yeah, it's hard to explain this movie. Todd, you just watched it last night. What did you think?
I think the best thing I can say in shorthand was when I looked it up afterwards and found out the movie Persona was a big influence on this, I was not in the least bit surprised.
Sorry. Yeah, no, that's a very and also I'll say this, Stanley Kubrick, far less problematic director than um sorry, I'm just trying to move this. Far less problematic director than Ingmar Bergman. So I don't know why this isn't going away. Okay, I don't know why this isn't. Sorry. One moment. Oop. Sorry, one moment. Sorry, I'm gonna stop the share 1 second because Zoom is being a little janky for me. Okay. Yeah, usually this thing goes away. Hmm. Don't know why this keeps doing this. Usually this there we are. Finally. I don't know why I did that. Okay. Anyway, on to the movie probably everyone knows her for, which is Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. We've talked about The Shining before. We actually talked about it 2 months ago when we did the Stephen King adaptation. So The Shining is a movie that has, when it came out, was not um very well received. Stephen King is on record as not liking it, but as I said before, whether or not Stephen King likes this adaptation of The Shining can depend on the day. Um, and it was actually had a number of Razzie nominations, including Shelley Duvall for Worst Actress, which is really awful in my opinion because she's great in this. Everyone's great in this. Time has been kind to The Shining. However, time is not exactly kind to what went on behind the scenes. But Shelley Duvall gets this part because she'd worked with a couple of other directors by this point. The most notably, she worked with Woody Allen for Annie Hall. But this is her first real breakout, not just from Robert Altman, but out of the more kind of new American cinema genre. So the 1970s really ushered in a lot of new talents. Again, you have people like Martin Scorsese, you have Francis Ford Coppola, you have Altman, you have Woody Allen, and more of a new, these aren't big studio productions, or if they are, they're not spectacles. There's new forms of comedy kind of breaking out, which Altman also did a lot of comedy, but this is her foray into horror. Although really, if you watch Three Women, you're like, this is a little bit of a preview of what she could do. So this is an adaptation of Stephen King's 1997 novel. So when I looked through one of the interviews with Interview, someone asked her like, "Oh, you're doing the Stephen King movie. Is it supposed? What's it about?" And she goes, "Oh, like, is it a big cast?" She goes, "No, it's Jack, myself, and a 5-year-old boy, basically. And there's a psychiatrist and an ex-gardener at the place where we're caretakers. It's very frightening." When I first heard of it, I was wondering why Stanley Kubrick would want to do this as a film, and then I read the book, and it turns out, I think, to be really primal about fears and the fears that one has in a relationship with another person, which is very nice, which is very true. However, her first describing it as a small movie with Stanley Kubrick, as if it's a small small indie film. I'm like, man, if only we had all known what this movie would become. But this was a departure not just in terms of genre, but also in terms of the filmmaking technique. Because she goes from working with Altman, who is very, okay, I trust you. I know what you can do, and if I want you to change anything, I'll tell you. And people like, Woody Allen, who also, my deep misgivings with him as a person aside, also tends to give his actors a very like, I trust that you know what I want. And relatively, quick, streamlined shoots. To Stanley Kubrick, who is a perfectionist, the shooting for this movie took almost a year, and my gosh, he's up there with Michael Cimino in terms of how many takes he'll do for a shot that he wants, and is very controlling for his actors. So, what happened with on the set of The Shining has almost become a bit of a Hollywood legend itself. So there's been talk for years and a lot of articles written about Stanley Kubrick on the set of The Shining, but particularly his treatment of Shelley Duvall. And from what I have found, and I mean, I bought into this idea for a while that Stanley Kubrick essentially tortured Shelley Duvall into a breakdown, and that's why she stopped acting. Now, clearly looking at her filmography, that is not entirely true. And even the idea that he tortured her into a breakdown does not seem to be the case. But yes, Hollywood legend had it that Kubrick treated Shelley Duvall so badly, she completely, devolved into mental illness. And that is not true. If a person is mental illness, a lot of cases it's already there. Um, but it was interesting to kind of go over different accounts of what might have happened on the set of The Shining. So, according to a lot of articles I read, the shoot was over a year long. It was actually extended because there was a fire on one of the sets. And this was 6 days a week, up to 16 hours a day. And it was also a small set, it was a small cast. So Kubrick basically had two adult actors he was working with a majority of the time, Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. Jack Nicholson had to be angry and insane. Shelley Duvall had to be scared. So, because if you've seen The Shining, Jack Nicholson is a person who is on the edge and ready to crack. Wendy Torrance is someone who has to walk on eggshells around her husband. Um, so what's interesting is when interviewers have even in like the 1980s, when Shelley in and later in her life when she talked about The Shining, she did not really her responses did not really support the idea of Stanley Kubrick bullied me into a breakdown. Was actually funny is for there was a Hollywood Reporter interview in 2021. And when Seth, the interviewer, asked her about The Shining, he said she immediately looked at him and said, "Okay, what's your angle?" So apparently she's heard some of these rumors as well. Um, so there were multiple takes. Duvall herself even said, like, yeah, after the 35th take, uh, she goes, Duvall says, Kubrick doesn't print anything until at least the 35th take. I don't know if that's a joke. Although Todd, you're very familiar with Kubrick's work, it probably isn't.
Again, particular is putting it very,
Yeah.
very mildly.
Yeah. She goes, 35 takes, running and crying and carrying a little boy. It does get hard. In full performance from the first rehearsal, that's difficult. But she also talked about like before a scene, she'd put on a Walkman, she'd listen to sad songs. She also lived alone at this time. So, Hollywood Reporter also spoke to Angelica Houston, who was dating Jack Nicholson at the time. They lived in London together, but she got a small flat by herself and a couple of pets. And Houston kind of said, as she put it, she's like, both Kubrick and Nicholson could be rough on Duvall. And she said, quote, I got the feeling certainly through what Jack was saying at the time that Shelley was having a hard time just dealing with the emotional content of the piece. And they didn't seem to be at all sympathetic. It seemed to be a little bit like the boys were ganging up. And that might have been completely my misread of the situation, but I just felt it. And when I saw her during those days, she seemed generally a bit tortured, shook up. I don't think anyone was being particularly careful of her. So that's a third person perspective of it. But whenever interviewers have asked her about it, Duvall has just said, like, the shoot was rough. The shoot was hard. She's like, I had to put myself in a really rough emotional position. It was physically hard because again, I had to hold this bat and swing it for multiple takes. I had to carry this child for multiple takes. I had to cry all day. So, but she doesn't speak ill of the film, and when she was speaking with shocked with both the Hollywood Reporter and the New York Times, she spoke well of, you know, playing of Kubrick and Nicholson. She's like, no, they were good to work with. And there's one where she's like, she has fond memories of the experience. Mr. Kubrick and Miss Duvall would play chess during the breaks, and the crew would sit around smoking cigarettes and eating Big Macs. So, and she also talked about when she's just like, I kept thinking about women who are actually in this situation, who have abusive partners, who have spouses with a hair trigger temper and have to make that decision to eventually leave. And she's like, how horrible it must be for them. So I think in terms of like what actually happened on the set, I think it's a mix of multiple things. I think Shelley Duvall, she put herself in a very emotional state because she felt, well, this is my job as a performer. Um, and she also probably felt okay, if the director's telling me he wants something, if he's saying you're wasting my time, okay, I have to do better. Because yeah, there is video behind the scenes video of Stanley Kubrick telling Shelley Duvall, "Look, you're wasting my time here." But that also does not remove the fact that Stanley Kubrick was rough not just on Shelley Duvall but on other performers, and he might have been unduly rough on her to get that performance out. But the whole narrative that he bullied her into a breakdown, that just does not seem to hold up based on everyone's experience. But that does not mean Stanley Kubrick treated anyone well on the set of The Shining. I think, Todd, you've said that everyone was kind of ready to kill him by the time that shoot was over.
It was between kill, just varying degrees of at their wits' end. There's another kind of famous legend that goes around that Scatman Crothers went from working on this to working on a film with Clint Eastwood, a director who was famously a one and done on takes. Supposedly, as the story goes, the first time he heard there was only going to be one take, he broke down in tears.
Yeah. But this was also not entirely out of the ordinary at the time, because this is also around the time we had Michael Cimino making Heaven's Gate and famously doing one take for like 67, doing one scene, 67 takes of the same thing, and just Chris Christopherson being at his wit's end. So but this was not done with the intent to psychologically torture the actors. This was done because these directors are insanely perfectionist. But it does not end well for the actors or the crew. But moving on from that, after The Shining, I mean, Shelley Duvall also in 1980 did have Popeye. And then in 1981, she had a quick role in Time Bandits, directed by Terry Gilliam, but she pivoted to television in the 1980s. And that's where we get to one of my favorite things, and this is how I was introduced to Shelley Duvall, which is the Showtime series Fairy Tale Theater. Now, this wasn't just a show she starred in, this was something she created. She was the host, she was the producer, she was the actor, and she had made through the decade of the 70s a lot of famous friends in Hollywood. She was also friendly with a lot of other people. Like she would just hang with Andy Warhol and stuff, which I'm just like, man, but the 70s was truly a different time. And she envisioned it being a way to bring the magic of fairy tales to kids, but also make it entertaining for adults. And there's a great LA Times interview that I found from her where she's talking about children's programming at the time. And she goes, "Oh, it's all just half-hour animated toy commercials now," which was kind of what a lot of TV shows for kids had become. Actually, there is a great book called The He-Man Effect, which is about how that came to be and how children's programming went from being educational to advertising. And she wanted to make something different, something alternative. And she also loved fairy tales. She loved stories. So each episode is a retelling of a classic fairy tale, or in some cases, like an American legend with an all-star cast. The first episode is The Frog Prince with Robin Williams as the Frog Prince, Candy Clark is in it as the Queen, Terry Garr as the Princess. My first episode was actually The Boy Who Left Home to Find Out About the Shivers, which has Christopher Lee and it's narrated by Vincent Price. You have Mick Jagger playing um, a Japanese Man in the Nightingale. Casting in that one probably hasn't aged that well. Let's be real, it definitely hasn't aged that well. But this was the 1980s. Carrie Fisher was in it. Jennifer Beals played Cinderella. Billy Crystal's in it. There's the Three Little Pigs with Jeff Goldblum as the big bad wolf. There's Mary Steenburgen playing Little Red Riding Hood. It's a really great series, and I actually have it all on DVD. I found it at a used film and poster sale a couple of years ago for $5, and I'm like, this is mine. This is my treasure now. I have yet to subject Todd to any episodes, but one day I will.
Now, we did watch the Frog Prince one, which I gotta say, again, impressed by the casting in that.
Oh yeah, no, the casting is what really sells it, because if you do go back and watch it, the sets, really nice, are definitely, you see the budgetary constraints, same with some of the special effects, but this is a show that has a lot of real charm to it, and that's because Duvall had so much this was like her baby. She had a lot invested in this. And in the same interview, she says, I wanted to be a scientist when I was growing up, and producing is like being a scientist, putting all the elements together to make it work and to create something new. And she created something really wonderful with fairy tale theater. And a lot of elder millennials like myself, and probably some Gen Xers, for her, for us, our first introduction to Shelley Duvall was her opening up the show saying, "Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall," and telling us about what new fairy tale we're going to watch. And she ended up parlaying this into a number of different shows. So after, like, not after fairy tale theater, but kind of during it, she made Tall Tales and Legends, which was more about American legends. And she also was a producer in a TV movie called Frog. She made Nightmare Classics, Shelley Duvall's Bedtime Stories, and then in 1990 she was in Mother Goose's Rock and Rhyme with the man who would become her partner, Dan Gilroy, who was actually in the band that Madonna was in before she went solo. So she played Little Bo Peep in Mother Goose Rock and Rhyme and ended up meeting the person who became the love of her life. But as the 1980s came to a close and the 1990s started, she was already starting to see a lot of her film work kind of go to the wayside a little bit. Some of it was she was very invested in producing children's television, but as the 1980s went on, and definitely as the 90s began, people who looked like Shelley Duvall, you just started to not see them in movies as much anymore. Um, there was a little bit of the return from like the mid 90s with the indie scene with people like, Quentin Tarantino, the Coen brothers, Kevin Smith. Honestly, Shelley Duvall would fit in really well in a Coen brothers movie, wouldn't you think?
I can see Cohen's, and since you brought him up earlier, maybe Wes Anderson.
Oh yeah, oh no, she would be great in a Wes Anderson film. But I do think some of that is kind of what happened. It's just her, like, and there are a lot of actresses that this happened to. Of course, this unfortunately usually happens to actresses more than actors. Were when the industry changes, and in the 1980s, the auteur era ended. It became a lot more studio and producer dominated at that point, and the people you started to see in movies started to look a little bit more kind of perfect again. The quirky look wasn't really there. Um, so in that happens, another person where this happened to, I was thinking about recently was Linda Manns, who is in Days of Heaven, Out of the Blue. If you've seen Days of Heaven, she's the young girl who has the voice of someone who smoked 3 packs a day. But she was someone where as she aged, she talked about just, like, yeah, the roles just weren't there for me after a while. It was hard to find a place for her on screen, so she retired. Um, and so this is kind of, she had some work in the 90s. She kind of, movies that frankly were beneath her, like Suburban Commando. She was in Portrait of a Lady with Jane Campion. And she isn't this cute little movie called Home Fries. It's not a great movie, but again, it's cute and serviceable. And her final roles in 2002 is Mana from Heaven. But again, I feel like this rumor started more in the 2010s more than anything, but people think that her treatment on The Shining was why she broke down and left Hollywood. But the reason she ended up leaving Hollywood in the 90s were for more personal reasons. So there was the 1994 earthquake in LA. She lost her home, and I think she lost a lot of pets in that earthquake as well. And one of her brothers was sick, so she decided to move back to Texas, and she stayed there. And even before that, she was starting to kind of go like, what do I really do? I want to have, the work life balance. And she talked about she was going to be in a movie, but she decided, you know what? I have a wedding and I'd like to do that. So she just turned down a role, and so she says, you can't lose your perspective on life there. I won't do anything for a job. So she was also one of those people where it's like, okay, I'm not going to work if it means having to sacrifice part of my personal life. Um, but in 2004, no, 2004, 2024, when the New York Times interviewed her, she talked about what her kind of fade from stardom. And she said, I was a star. I had leading roles. People think it's aging, but it's not. It's violence. And when the interviewer asked her to expand on how it's violent. She said, "How would you feel if people were really nice and then suddenly on a dime, they turn on you? You would never believe it unless it happens to you. That's why you get hurt because you can't really believe it's true." And I get that that's really talking about, once she left Hollywood or even like in the 1980s, maybe not getting roles. She didn't really expand upon that too much, but when that interview came out, people speculated we've heard about this with a lot of women who've worked on toxic sets where they then become branded as difficult, although I don't believe that happened with Shelley Duvall with her being a producer. But were the rumors of her like crying too much on the set of The Shining, did some people be like, I don't want to work with her anymore? Or was she just upset that even though she lived in Texas, no one reached out to her to be in films anymore? There were also other struggles as well. So she had had health issues by the time she'd been interviewed in the 2020s. She had had diabetes and complications from that. She had actually had mobility issues due to that. But there were also confirmed mental health issues. There had never been a diagnosis named, and very possible she had never gotten a formal diagnosis, but there were other issues with paranoia and hallucinations as well, and that might have also been something that had hindered her, but we never there was never a definitive answer as to when that became a big issue for her. But her partner, Dan Gilroy, did talk about, like, once they were in Texas, she would start to feel that people were coming after her. And that was as early as the 1990s. And sadly, her mental health issues were exploited, and I think a lot of people probably remembered this in a very um, horrific public um, display. Again, I put interviews in quotations because that was not an interview. In 2016, when Dr. Phil, who I don't think is a real doctor, Todd, could you check that for me?
One moment.
Yeah, or if he is, he's not a doctor anymore, but I know a lot of people like Oprah, but between Jenny McCarthy and Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil and that guy who wrote that book that turned out to be a lie, Oprah has inflicted a lot of unsavory people upon us. But Dr. Phil aired an interview, or more accurately, clips of an interview with Shelley Duvall, and she was talking. A lot of people were shocked when they saw this. She was basically kind of talking, rambling really about a lot of delusions, including one that Robin Williams, who had taken his life 2 years prior, was alive and a shapeshifter, that there were people coming after her. She was talking about UFOs and saying, like, I think I do need help. And the public outcry, if you were on social media, I think this is what truly tanked Dr. Phil in the court of public opinion, because everyone's reaction to this, I mean, some of it was, oh my gosh, what happened to Shelley Duvall? Is she okay? Is someone taking care of her? But the overwhelming reaction was, what are you doing putting a sick woman on television like this? And again, just people saying this is someone who is very unwell, who does need help, and you know what she does not need? Cameras pointed in her face. Um,
So to answer your question
okay.
quick, apparently he does hold a doctorate in psychology, but he stopped renewing his license back in 2006.
Okay, all right. So as of right now, not a doctor? Was a doctor, not a doctor right now. Yeah, I would talk. I don't think he had been in great public standing at that point, or I think people just looked at his show as like another Jerry Springer style show. But I think this is what made people hate him. They're like, "What are you doing?" Um, he still maintains that this show was to try to get her in touch with a doctor, and he still, as of, I looked at as of 2023, he has said he does not regret doing this interview. But Shelley Duvall regretted doing this interview. So when she talked to the reporter from the Hollywood Reporter, uh she'd said So first the reporter talked to Dan Gilroy and her mother. Her mother was still alive at that point. Gilroy had said he had never been contacted by anyone on Dr. Phil's team, and he did not even know that this interview was happening. And her mother said similarly, Duvall actually ended up telling the reporter, like, oh, yeah, they kept trying to call my mom, and my mom kept hanging up the phone and saying, do not contact me or my daughter again. So once her family got hold of word of what was happening, they're like, we are not doing this. And actually, a nice piece from that Hollywood Reporter interview was when a waitress who did know who Duvall was, saw that he was a reporter. She came up to him and said, "You're not working with that guy, are you?" He goes, "No." She goes, "Okay, I just want to let you know we take care of each other here." So it's nice that she did seem to have a support network, but very clearly, as Duvall said in that interview, I found out the kind of person he is the hard way. But what it did, I guess the one good that came out of it was there was a renewed interest in her, but a lot of people came to her defense, including Stanley Kubrick's daughter, who you can Google if you want. I would not say Vivian Kubrick is, I think she is her own brand of a little out there, but she did try to raise some money for her health treatment. It fell through. There was some speculation that it fell through because Vivian Kubrick is a member of Scientology. But as she put it, she said that she said, quote, I spoke today with Shelley's mother, Bobby, and explained that after her discussion with SAG-AFTRA and the fact that Shelley is on government benefits, they cannot afford to accept any large donations at this time. Which is true if you are a person receiving government benefits, especially if you're on disability. You cannot have a lot of money, or else you will not get benefits. So I think that's probably closer to the truth than something nefarious from the Church of Scientology. And far be it for me to give the Church of Scientology any credit or goodwill. But knowing how a lot of government benefits work, I'm like, yeah, that's probably the case. But it did kick off a lot of people going like, yeah, what did happen to Shelley Duvall? Why didn't she act anymore? And so for the general public and a lot of younger cinephiles, it caused them to go back and watch some of her old movies and to try to find like old interviews she did. It did also unfortunately kind of bring about the rumor that Stanley Kubrick caused all of this and bullied her into a breakdown. But the other thing was a lot of reporters wanted to speak to her, and basically, as Seth Abramovich of the Hollywood Reporter put it, he said, I only knew that it didn't feel right for McGraw's insensitive sideshow to be the final word on her legacy. And Saskia Solomon of the New York Times also talked to her in April of 2024. So there were a lot more reputable reporters who wanted to actually say, like, okay, I want to hear it from you, like, not about what you're not feeling, well over, but talk about your career, talk about you like. And so Abramovich, when he talked to her for the Hollywood Reporter, he did say, like, yes, there were some moments where she kind of did some free associative conspiracy theory type of things. And he's like, I'm not publishing those because it's not what I'm here to talk about. But he said there were also long stretches where she was very lucid and very keyed in and could talk about a lot of stuff in her career. And that was the one where when he asked her about making The Shining, she looks at him and goes, "Okay, what's your angle?" So he's like, "No, she's clearly still there. It's just there is something that has not been named that she is also dealing with." There's also a director, Lee Unkrich, who's an animation director. He is a big Shining fan, and he was able to get in contact with her and talk to her because he's trying to put together this big book about the making of The Shining, a big Tash and coffee table book. And he said when he talked to her as well, she's like, she was really happy to see this behind the scenes stuff and could point to certain behind the scenes pictures and say, oh, well, I know that happened, what that's referencing, or I know the conversation I was having at the time. So it did spark a renewed interest in her film, and there were also creators who wanted to give Shelley Duvall a comeback, and she was able to have one final film, which was The Forest Hills, and it was a horror film, which, as she put it, she goes, if you ever do a horror film, other horror films are going to come to you no matter what you do, which is true. The horror industry will always welcome you back. Um, and the makers of the Forest Hills actually were able to work with her because she had mobility issues due to diabetes, and they were able to bring a remote crew to where she lived so they could work with her filming her scenes. But sadly, in 2024, she passed away at 75, only days after her birthday. And her partner, Dan Gilroy, posted a really nice message. And just saying she's free now. And that was a photo from the New York Times interview with her, which she passed away July 11th, and the interview was published on April 25th. And again, like a lot of people, like the Hollywood Reporter interview is 2021. That is great. But a lot of people look at the New York Times one as that's kind of the final word for her because it talked about not only her work, but just why she endures for so many people. This like quirky, skinny, twiggy girl from Texas is something that even 20 or so years after she made a movie, a lot of people still find her so endearing and so interesting. And there was a woman who runs a fan site for her. She goes, she was such an enigmatic force. There are actors today like Anya Taylor-Joy and Mia Goth who have similar features and acting styles, but there'll never be another Shelley. And I definitely think for someone like a Mia Goth, like Shelley Duvall walked so Mia Goth could run. And I think that's her legacy, not only the art that she leaves behind, but the fact that she opened the door for other kind of quirky girls to not just become, character actors, but to become stars in their own right. And just a couple of additional acting credits. She's in Annie Hall, she's in Time Bandits. She is in, if you're a Tim Burton fan, the original live action short for Frankenweenie. She is the mother in that film. She's also in Roxanne, Portrait of a Lady. Um, and again, Suburban Commando, not a very good film. That's one where I'm like, this is a criminal misuse of Shelley Duvall here. But again, she stayed working as much as she could when she lived in LA. And this is an image from the Hollywood Reporter interview. And if I think of Shelley Duvall being older, this is the image I want to have in my head of her, not her very clearly in distress in that Dr. Phil piece, but someone who's just very happy in her life in Texas, who is, a local character in the town that she lives in and living with her partner and her mother and still in contact with her family. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, someone said, Diane, did she make a lot of money? The salaries people had back in the day definitely aren't what they are now.
Mhm.
There was a comment that she made in, I believe it was the New York Times interview, where she said, you have to protect your money. So I do think she might have made some money, but maybe had lost it or it had not gone as far as it could.
Mhm.
Maybe she didn't have a good royalties deal. The one downside is the interviews that she gave, she did not go in depth on some of these answers, and I don't know how much her partner wanted to go into that, but it definitely sounded like she did not have as much money as she wanted to, or she could have made some not great investments.
Mhm.
And that unfortunately happens to a lot of performers, even people who made a ton of who worked a lot back in the day, they can still end up with not much. That happened to Ida Lupino, who acted a lot, directed a lot, but towards the end of her life did not have as much, like, did not have a ton of money, and other people did step in to help her. And that's,
Mhm.
again, I made this point when I talked about Hollywood strikes during the SAG strike. Most actors are not making Brad Pitt, Scarlett Johansson, Tom Cruise levels of money. I believe it was the average income for a lot of SAG members is like $45,000 a year. And that's an average. And again, even if you make a lot of money, like Robert Altman was not a blockbuster style director. So if you were in movies from him, you weren't making a ton of money. And if you live in LA, LA is very expensive. It's very easy to lose that.
Mhm.
Or if you are treating a medical condition,
Mhm.
I mean, we've seen this with regular people. If you're treating a medical condition, you can lose money very quickly.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
again, unfortunately, a lot of that is speculation, but the only thing I could really
Yeah.
find to go on is where she's like, well, you got to be sure to protect your money, which
Yeah.
fortunately can happen. Um, but yeah, no, I was very happy to do this program. There was definitely something where I think like a lot of people, we saw that Dr. Phil interview. It's like, I do not want the final word on this very talented person to be that. And I also really wanted to kind of look into the what exactly happened on the set of The Shining, because I feel like that has kind of grown into a narrative that does not exactly accurately represent what happened. But again, this is not to excuse Stanley Kubrick. I would not want to work for Stanley Kubrick. But does anyone have any more questions? But if not, I would say absolutely, if you can, look up any of the work she did with Robert Altman. And I'm pretty sure a majority of the fairy tale theater episodes are just free up on YouTube, which you can watch. In case you're not like me and just a physical media hoarder. Seriously, I was so happy when I found that box set. I was just like, this is like Christmas morning. But yeah, check out Fairy Tale Theater. That stuff is great, and especially if you have kids that you want to show like fairy tale stuff to, it's a lot of fun. I don't know if it'd be like entirely great for like really young kids. They might be bored with it, but definitely like for me, I was like 8 or 9 when I first saw it, and I loved it. So, all right, and with that, Todd, would you like to just make another pitch for your not Albert Brooks, although we should do an Albert Brooks program.
That we
It's
definitely need to do at some point.
Mel Brooks next month.
Oh, how do I put this on the spot?
One of the funniest men to ever grace the screen.
I'm just gonna borrow the line I used in the copy. From the producers of the movie to the producers of the musical, we're covering all of Mel's work here.
Awesome. So join us next month when Todd takes the wheel for our Mel Brooks program. Get ready to laugh, everyone. All right, have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem.